Now quite an intuition for why that is so, but we're going to be more explicit. Imagine, say Myra wants to start a new business. She wants to start a catering business for the LA area, okay? So she's going to be delivering food and stuff to places in the LA area. And what she needs, she thinks, is a small fleet of, say, Toyotas, small Toyotas, say 100 cars, small cars, all what she needs. And she knows a Toyota dealer out there who's willing to sell this fleet to her for $1,000 a piece, $100,000, correct? That's what she needs in order to get started, to run her business. However, she knows of a better system to run her business, a cheaper one. She's a powerful woman. She has links to the mafia, and she has her neighborhood terrorized. And so she's decided she's going to do something else, which is going to render her business cheaper for her. She's going to draft her neighbor's cars. Because that's cheaper. That's cheaper. Now, her neighbors have, Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, Volvos, a few small Toyotas, but for the most part, it's a mixture of cars, okay? Now, let me ask you this question. We know how much she needs to run her business with a fleet of 100 small Toyotas, right? By doing this, if you add up the cost of those cars she's drafting from her neighbors, will the total amount, the total cost be higher or lower than 100,000? Astronomically higher. Much, much, much higher, right? Maybe a single car she's drafting may cost $100,000 in itself, or $50,000. So she's going to invest an unnecessarily high economic value in running her business, correct? When it could be run at a much lower cost. And what's worse, she's going to be using economic resources which are also not even the best, because what you need is small cars that you can park easily by the front of a business or something, not a large, Toyota, Mercedes-Benz or a convertible BMW. You don't need those cars. They're not even good for what you want to do with them. So she's going to run her business at a much, much higher cost, but it's cheaper. Now, you are the postmodern thinkers by now. It's cheaper for whom? Is it cheaper for her neighbors? No, it's not cheaper for her neighbors. It's way more expensive for her neighbors. Well, that's exactly what the Gates Commission says is happening with the draft. Not paying someone when you get something from them is always cheaper, I mean, next semester, when you need to buy your books, go to the bookstore, and when no one sees you, you can, because that's cheaper, isn't it? Isn't that cheaper? It's cheaper. Well, that seems to be the kind of reasoning behind the draft, according to the Gates Commission. When you don't pay for something, it's always cheaper, isn't it? Well, is it really cheaper? Cheaper for whom? Cheaper for those who don't pay for it, correct? Not for the others. So when it comes to public finances, we want to look at what kind of a total investment is being made in running a public service. We don't care if it's cheaper for a few people here, it's for society as a whole. What kind of investment are we making? With the draft, we are drafting people who we would have to pay normally under an old volunteer system, $3,000 a month, $4,000 a month, $5,000 a month, and extremely high values, and we are appropriating them like she appropriates her neighbor's cars, the same, okay? And those are real values we're appropriating. And what's worse, those guys are not even the best for the business. We appropriating those high values. We're making such a high investment in this particular service, public defense, and we're not even making the best choice. Because this guy doesn't want to be in the army. He wants to be, he's a doctor, he was a painter or something. He's not even going to be a good soldier, like with the Toyotas. No, those are the best cars. We don't need the expensive cars. They're not even going to be good for what we want to do. So we're making a very expensive service, which is not even good, just so some people may save a little money. That's what the Gates Commission says. The Gates Commission says this is an unconstitutional tax, and they give this example. They say it is as if we decided to run some public service, say public TV or freeway construction or something, by imposing a special tax on a particular segment of the population. Say women who are 30 years or older and who have green eyes. Completely arbitrary, based on gender, age, physical condition. Those people are going to pay for public TV and no one else. Well, the Gates Commission says if such a law ever was passed, it would be struck down by the courts immediately as unconstitutional. They say, well, that's exactly what happens with conscription, except that because it is paid in kind, the cost is hidden. It appears there's no cost. Of course, there is a cost. But now, up until the early 20th century, and still today in some countries, when you are called up for service, you are given two options. Okay, you give us $100,000 or whatever it is, or you serve for 2 years. That makes it so explicit that it is a tax. Just because you are a male and you have this particular age, you are going to put up with the burden of this public service. Either give us $100,000, or if you don't have the money, you come and do it. Or if you give us the money, we'll hire someone else. So we place a special tax on you just because of who you are. The Gates Commission says that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. That is completely unconstitutional. That's basically what the conscription tax is, how the Gates Commission defines conscription. By saying, let me summarize again, okay? It's a tax. Number one is a tax. If there is no money involved, conscription seems to go up in smoke. Why do I say that? Well, conscription is always embellished with this patriotic language. It seems that if you refuse to be drafted, you are being unpatriotic. You're not being a patriotic person, this kind of thing. You're going to read about that in the readings for this week. But it so happens, the Gates Commission says that patriotism doesn't seem to really have much to do with it. It's just money. And the proof of it is that if we were to pay conscripts a regular salary, a regular market salary, conscription just wouldn't make any sense. Conscription today, the draft in the US will never be activated again. Even though you have registration for selective service, it will never happen, ever. Because although legally it could be activated by the president, if the draft was ever activated after the Gates Commission's findings, the draftees would have to be paid a regular market salary. If you are going to pay those people a regular market salary, why on earth would you want to have people who don't want to be there, who are not going to do a good job? When for the same money you can have all volunteers who will do a much better job. Therefore, there is no country on earth that has a draft and who pays the draftees a regular market salary. Once you are forced by the courts or by public opinion or whatever reason to offer a regular market salary to the soldiers, you don't want draftees anymore. Makes no sense. Which means all of this patriotic wording, think in postmodern terms, where they're just to disguise the real meaning of it, which is money, the draft. Money, taxation. Now, there are two kinds of draft systems. In Europe, there is what is called the, for the most part, a universal conscription. That's again just playing with words, calling it universal conscription. No draft is really universal, ever. Because at least half the population, women, are never drafted. And many men are not drafted either for a number of reasons, because they're married or because they have some physical condition or something. Okay, so it's kind of a deceiving word, misleading word. And in the US, the draft was selective. Why was it selective? Well, because the US, for one thing, the US has a tradition of all volunteer forces. The US is pretty much within the British tradition of all volunteer forces. And even when there was a draft here, still the large majority of the military was professional, was volunteer. The draft made a very small part, maybe about 10% or so of all the forces. Of course, 10% back then, when you had 2 million people in the military, was a lot. We're talking about 200, 300,000 people. But still, it was a relatively small percentage as compared to other countries. And so the draft, the state didn't need as many soldiers. So they couldn't really draft. If there were 1 million 18-year-olds every year, they couldn't draft that many people. They didn't want to. It would have been unnecessarily useless thing. So they had to be selective. So there was a lottery. And in that lottery, depending on the year you were born, the first letter of your last name, blah, 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 he might have to be going to Vietnam or to be drafted in any case, while he would be let free. Now that made the injustice of the draft even more bitter to swallow for people, because it was so clear that only a minority were being drafted. And why is that? The injustice was even more obvious than in the case of Europe, where everyone is drafted more or less. Okay? So in the US, still today, people have to register with the Selective System Commission, or whatever it is. Okay? Registration for Selective Service. Selective service. In other words, it is openly called selective service. It is selective. It's not universal. And that made people more angry about it. Special cases. Well, Israel, for example, in Israel, even women are drafted. Say if there is a very poor country where they have to pay, they have money enough to pay soldiers. Well, you see, you have to think of military service as just one more public service, that's all. As nothing special. I mean, if you can pay doctors, if you can pay policemen, whatever the salary is in your society, you should be able to pay soldiers, because by not paying soldiers, all you're doing is just saving some people money. They're keeping their money in their pockets, and you're burdening those people with an extra cost. So the question, what if we don't have enough money to pay the soldiers? What if people require such a high salary that we don't have enough money to pay them? That's not a question. If you want to have that service, that's the cost of it. That's it. That's the real cost you have to pay. If you want to have it, you have to pay it. In the case of Israel, well, that may be a different question, because they claim there's not enough people in there. There's not enough people, so they couldn't rely on an all-volunteer system. So Israel is perhaps, of all places, the only country in which it would make sense, if you have a draft, to pay them a market salary. You can rely on a free market because you need all the people you have of that age because of the special situation. Okay, well, if that is the case, at least be correct in that sense, and pay them a market salary, because of course there is money in Israel. Israel is not a third world country. There's money to pay that. But I don't know what countries we have represented here in this class. Raise your hand if you're from a different country, please. Okay. And India, I think India follows the British tradition. So there is